This is probably the first time you're hearing about this news, so I urge you to stay until the end before talking about it with your friends, because every detail matters. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The tension that enveloped the Jeddah Corniche Circuit that evening was not just palpable, it was electric, almost sentient. You could feel it crawling up your spine as the floodlights bathed the asphalt in a surreal, otherworldly glow. This wasn't just another Friday night free practice too. No, this felt different. Something was building. Something monumental. You could sense it in the eerie calm between the engine howls, in the twitchy radio speak, in the barely contained aggression from the drivers who had grown weary of politics, pressure, and perpetual second-guessing. And then, without warning, Formula One detonated into chaos. What unfolded next wasn't just a crash. It was a violent, volcanic eruption of suppressed rivalry, mechanical brutality, and psychological warfare. It was the kind of incident that doesn't just make headlines, it burns itself into the memory of everyone watching, live or through trembling replays. It all ignited in Sector 2, the high-speed serpent of Jeddah where margins are razor-thin and bravery borders on insanity. Lewis Hamilton had just scorched a purple first sector, not for glory, but data. He was deep in setup experimentation, fine-tuning the delicate ballet of brake bias, energy deployment, and differential behavior. Strat Mode 6, Delta -0.3, Rear Entry Diff -1, Bonington's voice crackled in his ears like static on a detonator countdown. Lewis wasn't hunting lap times. He was in his zone, balancing chaos and control like only a 7-time world champion can. But even champions can be caught off guard. Behind him, Charles Leclerc was a crimson missile, screaming through the concrete canyons in his SF-24 like a man possessed. His telemetry spiked with aggression. His heart rate probably defied medical logic. His frustration had been simmering for days. Earlier in the session, he'd been balked by a slow car in Turn 8. Then again in Turn 13. Ferrari had promised clear air. Instead, they handed him chaos. So when his engineer muttered, "Hamilton ahead, gap 2 seconds, he should be slow," Charles didn't hear reassurance, he heard a challenge. His reply was a dagger, "If he blocks me again, I swear." And then it happened. Turn 17. DRS open. Engine mode set to kill. Charles was pulling over 5G into the kink, eyes locked forward, grip on the wheel vice-like. Up ahead, the black Mercedes was exactly where he feared it would be, hovering on the racing line, weaving gently to keep heat in the tires. But Charles didn't lift. He refused. Not this time. He expected Lewis to dive out of the way. But Lewis, immersed in his own world of toggles, brake maps, and invisible delta targets, didn't see him coming. Or perhaps he saw too late. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was a game of chicken taken too far. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. In one split second of cruel cosmic miscommunication, whether by human error, engineer delay, or divine mischief, the gap collapsed. Bang. The contact was apocalyptic. At nearly 290 km/h, Charles's front left tire made direct, unrelenting contact with Lewis' rear right. The impact wasn't just a crash, it was a detonation. The Ferrari's nose dipped violently as the rear exploded skyward. The monocoque snapped downward, scraping the tarmac in a spray of sparks and carbon shrapnel. The sound? Imagine 1,000 guitars being shredded by a sledgehammer, overlaid with the scream of tortured rubber and the earth-shattering snap of titanium giving way. Charles's car pirouetted mid-air like a possessed dancer, slammed back down, then ricocheted toward the TechPro barrier with such force that nearby marshals instinctively flinched behind guardrails. The SF-24 embedded itself in the foam like a knife into flesh. Meanwhile, Hamilton's W15 was thrown into a demonic spin, sliding sideways like a possessed banshee, kissing the inner wall, then bouncing back into the racing line before collapsing in a mess of carbon fiber, the rear wing sheared off, diffuser dragging like a torn cape. And then, silence. No engine howl. No radio chatter. Just dust. Smoke. The red flag flew before race control could even blink. The track became a battlefield. Marshals sprinted. Fire extinguishers hissed. Mechanics back in the garages stared at the monitors in pure, unfiltered horror. Sky Sports cut to onboard replays that looked like scenes from a war zone. The paddock erupted into chaos. Toto Wolff was seen slamming his headset into the table so hard it cracked. Fred Vasseur stormed out of the Ferrari pit wall muttering expletives in French that needed no translation. In the Mercedes garage, George Russell sat frozen, staring at the wreck telemetry data of his teammate, while Ferrari Jr. Ollie Behrman, watching from the reserve garage, muttered, "Did that really just happen?" Medical cars arrived. Cameras zoomed in. And then, movement. Lewis, ever the warrior, unbuckled himself slowly, wincing as he climbed out of the wreckage. He looked around, more confused than angry, then walked to the back of the car, almost inspecting the damage himself. A moment later, Charles emerged too, limping, visor up, helmet crooked, his eyes wide with disbelief and rage. He didn't look at Lewis. Not once. Instead, he threw his gloves into the cockpit with violent frustration. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. The aftermath? Nuclear. Social media ignited like wildfire. Was it intentional? Why didn't Hamilton move? Why didn't Leclerc lift? Armchair experts debated with forensic precision. Hashtags like #HamiltonLeclerc crash, #Jeddah Corniche, and #F1 Armageddon trended within seconds. Fanbases clashed in comment section civil wars. Journalists swarmed the paddock like bees, chasing soundbites, chaos, and blood. The stewards launched an immediate investigation. Team radios were summoned. Telemetry poured over. Conspiracy theories blossomed. Was it a mind game? Was it retaliation? Was it just pure, tragic, high-octane miscommunication? But deep down, everyone knew the truth. This was inevitable. Two of the most fiercely competitive drivers in the modern era, on the limit, under pressure, in a track where bravery often overtakes reason. Something was always going to give. And when it didn't just break carbon fiber, it broke the illusion that practice sessions are safe, controlled environments. This was Formula One, raw and unfiltered. Savage. Unforgiving. Absolutely unforgettable. Yellow flags turned red before anyone could even register what was unfolding. One moment it was tension, the next, complete pandemonium. Within mere seconds, the safety protocols were shattered by the sheer violence of the crash. Carbon fiber exploded like glass under pressure. The impact was so brutal, so deafening, that even the most seasoned motorsport veterans in the commentary booth went dead silent. You could almost feel the shock reverberate through the asphalt, through the grandstands, through the chest of every single spectator present. It wasn't just a crash, it was carnage. Marshals were already sprinting across the tarmac, tripping over themselves in the desperate rush to reach the wreckage. Smoke began to billow from the twisted remains of both cars, curling upward like some grim signal flare. The once roaring crowd dropped into a stunned, breathless silence, as though the entire arena had gone into cardiac arrest. You could hear gasps. A child crying. An old man muttering prayers in Italian. For several seconds that felt like a lifetime, there was no movement from either cockpit. Not even a twitch. Not even a flicker. Just two mangled machines and the unbearable weight of uncertainty. And then, finally, Hamilton moved. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't heroic. It was raw, animalistic survival. He ripped at his harness like it was suffocating him, tore the halo padding off with bloodied hands that trembled from adrenaline and shock. His race suit was torn and scorched, smoke stains running up his thighs, the knees visibly burnt from contact with the glowing hot cockpit floor. His gloves? Shredded, threads dangling like wet paper, fingers twitching from the sheer force he had applied to the wheel upon impact. And then came Leclerc. Stumbling, swaying, alive, but barely upright. His helmet still on, visor cracked and smeared with something red blood. It was only when he pulled it off that the full extent of the chaos became clear. A deep gash ran along his left elbow, and his shoulder was twitching unnaturally. Blood dripped steadily onto the track as he limped towards the waiting safety car. But before he could even get there, Hamilton turned. He didn't speak at first. He stormed. Through the haze, through the wreckage, straight toward Leclerc like a man possessed. The crowd, sensing something colossal, started shouting, standing, phones recording. The marshals panicked. Medics looked on in disbelief. FIA officials screamed into their radios. But nothing could stop what was about to happen. Hamilton shouted, not just at Leclerc, but at the entire world. You never look. You just dive in like everyone owes you the corner. The words cut through the smoky air like a blade. Leclerc, already barely standing, clenched his fists and stepped forward with the fury of a man who had been building this rage for years. You think this sport revolves around you. You are in the middle of the F******ing track. It wasn't just a fight. It was a detonation of history, two titans finally exploding under the unbearable weight of mutual disdain. And then, shockingly, devastatingly, Leclerc shoved Hamilton. A hard, two-handed slam into the chest of a seven-time world champion. The collective gasp from the crowd was louder than the engines had been just moments before. Hamilton stumbled back, but retaliated. He didn't punch. He didn't retreat. He hit back with a stiff palm to Leclerc's shoulder, yelling with venom, "Don't you dare touch me." It should have ended there. But chaos has a momentum of its own. Leclerc lunged again. This time, he stepped directly onto a slick patch of oil near the curb. He lost all balance. His feet slipped out from under him like a bad dream, and down he went. The impact was horrific. He slammed backward onto a piece of debris, what used to be the front wing of his own Ferrari. The sharp edge sliced through his suit and into his back with terrifying precision. The scream he let out was primal, pain, rage, and disbelief all fused into one gut-wrenching sound. His body arched, twisted in agony. Blood pooled instantly. The marshals, now beyond panic, dove in. Medics swarmed him like bees, applying pressure to the wound as one official began screaming for a helicopter evac. Hamilton stood frozen, chest heaving, eyes locked on the scene he had just become part of, hands still clenched, his own wounds forgotten. Every screen in the world broadcasting Formula One went into emergency mode. Every journalist, every media outlet, every commentator went into overdrive. Twitter exploded. Fans wept. Children screamed. Grown men clutched their heads. This wasn't a racing incident. This wasn't a post-crash scuffle. This was a breakdown of every protocol, every restraint, every last thread of civility between two men who had, for years, been orbiting a singular point of explosion. And it happened. Right there. Right then. On global television. Live. Unfiltered. Unstoppable. Formula One was no longer just a sport. It had become something else entirely. Within moments of the terrifying collision, a wave of sheer chaos swept across the pit lane like a tsunami of disbelief. Leclerc, his face contorted in pain, was carefully strapped onto a stretcher by medics as horrified fans watched the live feed in stunned silence. Blood seeped through his race suit near the shoulder, a stark, haunting visual of just how brutal the impact had been. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton, legend, icon, and seven-time world champion, staggered away from his wrecked car, one hand clutching his side, the other wiping away the blood trickling from a gash just above his eyebrow. The cut was small but symbolic, evidence of a shockwave that would ripple through the entire world of Formula One. No one spoke. The mechanics stood frozen, like statues in branded overalls. Engineers stared at their monitors, jaws clenched, trying to process what the telemetry had just recorded. Even the journalists, those seasoned veterans of motorsport drama, exchanged wide-eyed glances instead of shouting questions. It was as if the paddock had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Back inside the garages, panic turned into protocol. Ferrari locked their doors and immediately summoned their legal and communications teams. An edited compilation of onboard footage, slow-motion replays, and team radio was packaged and sent directly to the FIA with an official complaint. The wording? Sharp as a scalpel, Hamilton demonstrated a reckless disregard for proximity awareness and failed to yield in a compromised zone. Mercedes wasn't far behind. Within the hour, they released a 10-page technical dossier complete with corner-by-corner telemetry overlays, GPS data, and comparative breaking points. Their claim? Leclerc had acted with premeditated disregard for spatial awareness, and had used a racing line that defied basic safety logic. To back it up, they circulated annotated screenshots and simulation renderings to the media, something that's almost unheard of during a live race weekend. Then came the storm. In the press room, where normally there's a buzz of jokes, coffee machines, and soft laughter, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Toto Wolff entered like a general returning from war, red-faced, eyes like ice, and lips sealed so tightly it seemed his rage could combust at any moment. When finally asked for a comment, he shot back, "This wasn't racing. This was a collapse, of judgment, of discipline, of mutual respect. I won't call names, But someone came here today looking for war, not a race. Barely 5 minutes later, Ferrari team principal Fred Vasseur stormed in. He wasn't just angry, he was volcanic. Slamming his notebook onto the table, he bellowed, "If the FIA doesn't react with full severity, they're choosing violence over values. This is not what we teach young drivers. This is not racing, it's reckless assault disguised as ambition." Meanwhile, in the sterile fluorescent-lit corridors of the medical center, the real consequences were unfolding. Leclerc's diagnosis sent shockwaves: a dislocated shoulder, a 7-centimeter gash across his upper chest that required 12 agonizing stitches, and a suspected hairline fracture in his clavicle. Despite the pain, Leclerc's first words, reportedly spoken through gritted teeth, were, "He did this on purpose." Hamilton wasn't faring much better. Though cleared to race, he was treated for multiple contusions, rib bruising, and a facial abrasion dangerously close to his eye. When asked by a team member if he wanted to rest, he responded with chilling calm, "Rest later. Right now, I want every second of that onboard footage." But while doctors stitched and physios massaged, another wound, one that can't be seen on scans, was festering rapidly, the total, possibly irreparable destruction of the relationship between the two drivers. Insiders, those shadows in the paddock who always seemed to know too much, were already buzzing. They said this was no isolated incident. That this crash was the climax of a feud boiling for over a year. Some pointed fingers all the way back to Monaco, where Hamilton allegedly made a quiet approach to Ferrari about a late career switch, only to be internally blocked by Leclerc himself. "He's a virus," Leclerc reportedly told one senior executive. "He turns every team into a political battlefield." Others whispered about Sao Paulo last year. Apparently, after a rough on-track battle, Hamilton cornered Leclerc in the hospitality suite, accusing him of playing games and endangering lives. The conversation escalated so quickly that team security had to physically separate the two. One source said it ended with Leclerc yelling, "Try that again and I won't miss next time." Even within their own teams, doubts have started to swirl. Privately, some Ferrari mechanics believe the team has pushed Leclerc too far, emotionally and physically. At Mercedes, a few key engineers are allegedly questioning whether Hamilton's hunger to prove he still belongs is clouding his judgment. One senior staffer reportedly said, "He's not fighting for wins anymore. He's fighting ghosts." And so, as the sun sets on a day that might go down as one of the darkest in recent F1 memory, one thing is clear: the crash was not just metal against metal. It was legacy against ambition, pride against pressure, and history colliding with the present in the most violent way imaginable. What happens next? No one knows. But one thing is certain: the 2025 season has just been split in half, before the crash, and after. Social media did not just react, it erupted, detonating across platforms like an uncontrollable supernova of speculation, outrage, tribal loyalty, and raw emotion. Within minutes of the incident in Jeddah, timelines were flooded with an avalanche of clips, slowed-down replays, pixel-by-pixel analyses, and wild fan theories that bordered on digital detective work. Hashtags like #JeddahWar, #Hamilton-Leclerc clash, and #F1 chaos didn't just trend, they dominated the global conversation, overtaking even geopolitical news in multiple countries. Twitter, now X, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and even LinkedIn were aflame with hot takes, conspiracy theories, and expert breakdowns. People were tracking tire temperatures and telemetry data like forensic analysts. Reddit threads exploded with minute-by-minute breakdowns, cross-referenced with radio comms and facial expression analysis from the onboard cameras. One TikTok video, which slowed down the crash to 0.05x speed and looped Leclerc's dramatic head snap 14 times, hit 10 million views in under an hour. Another viral post zoomed in on Hamilton's visor, claiming you could see the rage in his pupils. Discord servers were on fire. WhatsApp groups imploded with voice notes of fans screaming. The F1 subreddit temporarily crashed due to sheer traffic. Then came the leaked audio clips. One captured by an unknown source in the Ferrari medical bay had Charles Leclerc audibly shouting, through gritted teeth and while receiving treatment, the now iconic line, "Tell him he's finished." The clip, raw and unfiltered, had such intensity it got picked up by mainstream news outlets and reshared with dramatic orchestral music layered underneath. The memes exploded. Hamilton, on the other hand, was filmed stomping through the paddock, visor streaked with blood, jaw clenched, eyes still burning with fury as he muttered under his breath to a team member, "Entitled brat." The footage looked straight out of a Hollywood film, with lighting that felt too cinematic to be real, but it was real, painfully real. The media had a field day. Overnight, the clash went from a racing incident to a Shakespearean-level feud. The Battle of Jeddah, they called it. The Crown versus the Rebel. Pundits on Sky Sports F1 couldn't decide if it was a tragedy or a betrayal. Some framed it as the boiling point of a rivalry that's been simmering since 2019. Others claimed it was the start of something much darker. British tabloids plastered the story across their front pages with headlines like "War in the Desert" and "Charles Strikes Back." Sponsors were livid. Furious emails and urgent Zoom calls flew across time zones. High-level executives from multi-billion-dollar brands that have sponsored the sport for decades sent stern letters to both Mercedes and Ferrari, demanding a narrative correction and threatening to pull support if the drama continued unchecked. The tone was dire. This is no longer just a racing story. This is a reputational crisis. Team principals scrambled behind the scenes to coordinate PR damage control, but the beast was already out of the cage, and it had teeth. Liberty Media, which owns Formula One, went into full emergency mode. An unscheduled 2 a.m. crisis meeting was called with top FIA officials, with one Liberty exec reportedly slamming their laptop shut and yelling, "We're one headline away from losing control of this season." There were whispers of race cancellations, tightened regulations, and even mid-season behavioral protocols for drivers. Everyone was walking on eggshells, terrified that the Saudi GP weekend would spiral into something unrecoverable. But then came the image that sealed it all, the moment that would be screenshotted, memorialized, and turned into 1,000 memes, t-shirts, and conspiracy videos. Just past midnight, Charles Leclerc was filmed being wheeled out of the medical center. His right arm was in a sling. A thick white bandage was wrapped across his shoulder. His face was pale, clenched with pain and pride, and he refused to make eye contact with anyone. Not his race engineer. Not the medics. Not even the Ferrari PR staff silently following the wheelchair. The silence was deafening. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton was caught in a solitary walk through the empty pit lane. No entourage. No engineers. Just him, a shattered helmet cradled under his arm like a fallen soldier. He paused briefly at garage number 16 Ferraris, and stared at what remained of Leclerc's car, a mangled chassis resting beneath a jet-black tarp. For a heartbeat, the entire world held its breath. Then he turned, shoulders square, and walked off into the night. By morning, the footage had been watched more than 500 million times across platforms. Celebrities were weighing in. Politicians too. Children recreated the crash with toy cars. DJs were remixing the audio into rave tracks. It was no longer just a sport, it had become a cultural flashpoint. A cinematic saga. A global obsession. And everyone wanted more. No penalties. No fines. No grid drops. Just warnings. Just a few sterile lines in the official FIA report. Shared fault, miscommunication, highly unusual circumstances. That's what the world saw. A carefully polished sentence crafted to avoid choosing sides, to keep the political balance intact within the circus of Formula One. But those words were merely a smokescreen. Behind them? Devastation. Unspoken war. The kind of fallout that doesn't show up in race results or post-session press conferences, but in the eyes, the wheel-to-wheel duels, and the unbearable silence between teammates who no longer see each other as allies. What happened in Saudi Arabia wasn't a simple racing incident. It wasn't just a misunderstanding on track. It was a fracture. A rupture so deep that not even the cold efficiency of telemetry data or the bland neutrality of race stewards could cover it up. This was personal. And it had consequences that would echo far beyond the desert night where it began. From the moment the visor dropped the next morning, everything changed. The paddock knew it. The mechanics knew it. Even the junior drivers in the F2 paddock were whispering about it. The glances exchanged between the two drivers during the pre-race briefing were loaded with 1,000 unsaid words. No apology. No reconciliation. Just cold, razor-sharp silence. The kind of silence that cuts deeper than any public rebuke. This wasn't about tire strategy anymore. It wasn't about DRS zones or power units or even podiums. This had become something else, something darker. Every time they lined up next to each other on the grid, it felt like the fuse of a bomb being lit. The tension? Palpable. The kind that makes even the most seasoned engineers hold their breath as the lights go out. From here on, every corner they approach together will feel like a battlefield. Every braking zone will be a psychological minefield. Trust, once shattered at 300 kilometers per hour, doesn't rebuild overnight. It doesn't rebuild at all. These two are now trapped in a high-speed Cold War, one laced with paranoia, ego, and the ticking clock of championship ambitions. The Saudi Grand Prix wasn't just a race. It was a stage. And on that stage, the script flipped. What began as a tactical weekend turned into an operatic clash of wills, a mental war zone disguised in team colors and carbon fiber. A twisted game of psychological chess, where every move is broadcast to millions, every hesitation analyzed, and every error magnified by the unforgiving spotlight of global motorsport. The fans saw it too. They didn't need the FIA's report to tell them something was broken. You could hear it in the gasps as the cars danced dangerously close, in the crowd's collective heartbeat skipping with every near collision. Social media exploded. Memes, theories, slow-motion breakdowns of the incident from 12 different angles. Fans took sides. Analysts speculated. Ex-drivers whispered in coded language during commentary. What the FIA framed as a warning was, in reality, the opening volley of an emotional war. One that will now unfold not over weeks, but over laps, over milliseconds of judgment calls made at impossible speeds. In a sport where margins are measured in thousandths, there's now a growing space between these two drivers that cannot be quantified, a void filled with resentment, pride, and the haunting knowledge that everything has changed. So forget what the reports said. Forget the carefully worded statements from team principals trying to douse the fire with PR-laced diplomacy. The truth is blistering, and it's accelerating toward us with every race. Two of Formula One's most elite drivers are now locked in a psychological standoff. And every race they enter from this point forward will not just be about who finishes ahead, it will be about who blinks first. This is no longer Formula One as you knew it. This is high-octane drama, a slow-burn rivalry ready to ignite at any moment. And the most terrifying part? They're just getting started.